All right, thank you. I'm very pleased to talk about HackMotion today. So I've been involved with the company for a little over a year and a bit. I was doing some of my coach certification schools in Europe, and one of the attendees from Austria had HackMotion. It was the first time I had seen it, and it was very interesting just because obviously it's so portable. You just throw it in your golf bag, but the data that it was able to produce was very quick, very easy, and very accurate to itself. And I think that was the thing that got me the most was, if I was able to put it on and try different shots or try different short game shots, etc., I could get an immediate feedback right away. I didn't have to go back to the computer and, sort of download 16 things before I saw the results. So that was the beautiful thing about it, was totally immediate, and because of that I could make changes right away. And just a personal story with this, the interesting thing when I was fooling around with it was I teach about 6 or 10 different swing patterns, and I messed around with trying to swing different swing patterns so that way I could get some data from HackMotion on what I was doing with the wrist angles when I was doing these different patterns. And the interesting thing was whenever I hit a bad shot, what happened at the wrist level was exactly the same no matter what the pattern. So that kind of blew me away, because I realized at that moment that maybe it wasn't so much the swing pattern, it was actually what was going on at the wrist function. So because of that, I've now got to the point where, especially with my good players, my tour players, I don't really want to see their video. I don't need to see their video right away until after I've actually seen what's happening at the wrist level. And that's kind of what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is basically in the last year and a bit that I've been involved with the company, I really only see about 3 or 4 different ways that good players actually get it done. But it's very important that we understand the differences between the different styles. I was supposed to introduce myself. I apologize. Scott Cowx, been a PGA member of Canada here for 26 years. I am the 2019 PGA of Canada National Teacher of the Year, and I enjoy thoroughly looking deeply into the golf swing and so on. So without any further ado, let's sort of move through this and we can kind of take a look here. I think this, it's not going to let me play the video here. So basically the first methodology here that we see is sort of what we call a stable extension towards flexion model. And players like Tommy Fleetwood, Thorbjorn Olesen, a few other players like that tend to use this model. Actually, that's in the wrong order. I apologize. Sorry, let's go this way. So considerations in choosing your release model. So the question is, ask yourself using HackMotion. And this is really an important one. How does that player currently square the club face? Okay, so are they using a combination of supination and pronation in the, pronation, supination in the forearms? Are they going from flexion toward extension? Are they, is there a lot of radial and ulnar deviation through impact? Okay, we have to understand sort of how is that player actually making a good shot occur, because if we can understand that signature, we can then obviously influence that signature if it needs to move in a certain direction. The second piece that goes along with that is also how is the player dealing with club head speed? Okay, it does have to go somewhere. So as much as some players are trying to hold this off and sort of hold flying wedges and all the rest of that business coming through, in reality, the club head's obviously moving much faster than the hands or the body, so it has to go somewhere. And that club's either going to go toward extension, it's either going to move around the shaft, the speed's going to move around the shaft axially like this, or it could move back into sort of a radial deviation coming through. Most of the time, it's actually moving in all 3 planes. So we have to understand where that club head speed is going, and that's what the beautiful thing about the HackMotion is. The club face vector, basically there's only one vector on the sweet spot, is where is that face sort of pointed in space? And we have to understand, you know, as we swing this club down, where is that club face vector going from, and more importantly, where it's going to? So depending on the wrist styles, and I'll get into that in a minute, but depending on the options, we have quite a big variety of change there in that vector. So we have to understand how is that player actually utilizing that club face vector. Some players that go heavy into flexion, like your DJ, etc., are actually taking the vector from basically in the ground and then driving their bodies up and around and sort of raising the club face vector as they hit it. Your old school release, which we'll talk about in a second, is actually the opposite. The vector is actually pointed high and to the right, and they're actually turning this thing down into impact. So they might have exactly the same loft properties. They might have exactly the same sort of club face orientation properties, but the interesting thing about it is which direction did the player come from, and that's going to totally change what you do as an instructor and how you approach their swing changes. One that I think is really, really important is, does the player like to shape different shots or create one shot shape the majority of the time? You know, are they using path primarily to influence curvature and keeping the release style similar? Or are they manipulating the release each time to hit different windows and shot shapes, okay? And that's also a big thing in terms of maybe which choice I would go in with that direction. Let me just take a look here. Everybody can still hear me okay? Okay. What is that player's common miss? You know, are they going to miss it to the right? Are they going to miss it to the left? You know, what is that common miss that they have? Often we're going to see, depending on how the release vector of the club face moves, that determines whether they're sort of a block overdraw pattern or a pull and a fader. And that's happening right at the wrist level. And lastly here, a couple last points here. What is the club face vector doing through the bottom of the swing? Like I said, how is that vector moving through the impact interval? Is the face pointed sort of down toward the ground and adding loft as we hit it? Or is it pointing up in the sky and we're reducing loft? Because it could go either way. Lastly, you know, the other thing that I find with this is this gives me some options for lie angle and balancing camber and some of the equipment things that we have going on. We can understand perhaps how to tweak that equipment a little bit better. Okay, let me just see. No questions yet.
You're all good, mate. Keep going.
We're okay?
Yep, keep going through.
All right, great. Thank you. All right, so this is the first graph. So this is, you know, I just want to explain a little bit about the graphs and kind of what happens with the graphs there, because there's a lot of things that HackMotion does, and from a teaching perspective, it's very interesting because you can set parameters and benchmarks and things like that. Like over here on the left-hand side, we've got a category here with your players' data that you can go back and sort of archive and sort of highlight the ones you think are good swings. You've also got some tour data involved there from putting, chipping, as well as full swing data on short irons, middle irons, driver. And you will see roughly the same type of signatures, but perhaps the volume and the change in the wrist will be a little bit different. So one of the things that I really like about this first bit is swing option A is stable wrist flexion extension pattern. We'll call this the old school release, if you will. Tommy Fleetwood, Thorbjorn Olesen are amongst those players. What we get from this pattern is a couple things. This green line, okay, let me just go through this a little bit. The green line is flexion extension, okay? So the sensor itself is measuring each of these pieces independently. So it's measuring between two sensors, one in your hand, one in your wrist, and it's calculating how much it's moving this way, how much it's moving radial and ulnar, okay? And it's also calculating what we call a global rotation, okay? And that global rotation is happening because of, you know, movement here in the forearm, but also because your body turns, etc. So that number is a little bit different because it's not independent within the joint. it's actually sort of a reference to a certain extent to the target, okay? It's how much is that sensor turned all the way back, all the way through, and all the way through the finish. So when we look at these lines, the green line here is the flexion extension graph. This is the one where most players struggle, okay? At a tour level, we see only about a 20 to 25 degrees change overall in that graph, okay? So that wrist is not really changing a whole heck of a lot in good players. Now, when we see amateur golfers, we see upwards of 50, 60, 70 plus degrees of change in the flexion to extension graph. And considering that's your loft to a certain extent, that one's incredibly important to sort of be stable. So in this pattern, this is, we'll call this the swing guide type of a golf swing, or power package type of a golf swing, where the player, you know, from setup all the way up to the top is sort of retaining a certain amount of flexion all the way through the swing. And then right toward the golf ball, they increase this or turn this down a little bit to impact and sort of control the loft, or get that little bit of forward shaft lean, okay? Now what happens with that though is we understand where that club face vector is as the player comes down, is that loft is actually pointed high and to the right, and then at impact they're actually turning this vector down and toward the target, okay, and establishing a certain loft and a certain trajectory on the shot, okay. After impact, you know, the speed's got to go somewhere. So in this particular swing, this is Thorbjorn Olsen's swing, but in this particular swing, this wrist doesn't change much for a little period of time, and then it's going to move back toward extension, and that's what we're seeing with the green kind of coming up the other side here. Now, when we look at the blue is the radial and ulnar deviation. Okay, call that wrist cock up and down. Each one of us has this if we're any good. Generally, we're going to have some, but the timing of when we sort of unload this in toward ulnar deviation or downward motion is sort of shown here at the impact level. And again, in this type of a swing, what we get is a fairly stable wrist in terms of a loft. We get a fairly stable wrist with the radial and ulnar. And what ends up happening is the rotation is the purple, and that's the one that's moving back and forth, okay? And roughly at impact, we can see that it roughly crosses the 0 line at impact, okay? And we'll see some of that with some signatures, but sometimes we'll actually see some other things. So the interesting thing is, you notice that the purple one always starts at 0 for address. So it's saying that that is your orientation, okay? Now, on the way back, players rotating, okay, we can see that go toward the negative side, okay, this is negative, this is positive. They get to the top of the swing, obviously it starts to rotate back as they swing down, comes through, and they finish over here. So in this type of a swing, this swing has more rotation of the sensor, but less extension and less sort of radial, ulnar, radial recocking, okay? Or this is going to create a very long flat spot at the bottom of the swing, okay? So excellent way. We see this most of the time with push draw players, okay? This is generally the release pattern for a push draw player. A lot of our pros are going to fall into this category. Generally, the miss pattern will be high right, mid draw, or over draw left with this type of a wrist condition. All right, so we'll go through a couple points there. So old school, as I said, Tommy Fleetwood, Thorbjorn. Easy way to train this one is just have your players use a swing guide or power package. Be careful of the overloaded radial deviation at the top because that causes early extension. So the problem with wrist joints is what we have to understand is that radial and extension go together, ulnar and flexion go together. So if a player is going to add a whole bunch of radial and try and downcock this, most often they're going to push this wrist into extension. And that becomes very dangerous as they push this into extension. That face is wide open, and now they require a lot more of this type of a movement around the golf ball. As I said, the club face vector has more loft coming into the golf ball, but then less loft because we're turning it down as we exit the golf ball. So if we kind of imagine a trajectory on a wall in front of us, it kind of goes from high right to low left, and that's how that vector is being turned down, if you will, at impact. Okay. When we see the second model, what I call cobra pattern or flexion to extension model. Now this is interesting because this is 100% reversed. Okay, 180 degrees reversed actually. Okay, and there's lots of players that use this. Victor Hovland, DJ Brooks Koepka, Colin Morikawa, to a certain extent, are all players that use this. Okay. Colin's got a beautiful swing, but totally exhibits the opposite pattern in terms of what the wrists are doing, okay? So we look at this graph, this is completely backwards, okay? And this player here is one of my very good college players, exhibits these wrist conditions. And a couple things we want to understand. First of all, what's going on with the green one, okay? And we see the shape of the green one, which is a flexion extension. So this player, if we kind of go through this, whereas the stable wrist kind of just stayed flat, 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 and then increased flexion at impact, this one's starting in a little bit of extension, and this player is pushing this wrist hard into flexion about halfway back, keeps that in a fair amount of flexion, drives their pivot very, very hard, and at impact, the wrist is actually starting to come out a little bit, okay? Now, it's not actually moved into extension, but it's moving toward extension. And that has huge, 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 huge consequences in terms of where the speed goes and what's going to happen. First and foremost here, we're going to see that this player has to drive their pivot very aggressively. So we see a lot of young players who really hit the ball very high, very straight with this type of a pattern. If you can drive your pivot fast enough, you can sort of outrace, if you will, this wrist, which wants to get pulled back into extension, okay? So the interesting thing is the speed here, whereas Thorbjorn and Tommy Fleetwood were actually working around the shaft to a certain extent and rotating this player is actually more like a Frisbee. They're releasing it this way and releasing that club speed forward, okay? So technically, if you really want to call this a time scoop, it is, but we still have a certain amount of loft here, okay? In this case, about negative 8 to 10 degrees or so at impact from zero. So this player is still de-lofting this, but where the wrist came from is 180 degrees opposite to where Tommy Fleetwood came from. As a result of the club actually moving toward extension, the interesting thing is the purple, which is the rotation. This player actually holds their forearm about 40 degrees or so open at impact. So they're releasing the speed this way, but the forearm is actually quite a bit more open than where it started, okay? Now, let's think about that from an anatomy standpoint for a second. So if I've got this rotated about 40 degrees, often this arm is more pinned against my chest, and we're driving this thing kind of this way through the shot. Okay, so very different release mechanism here, and again, this stuff you're not going to see very well on video, so it's nice to have the HackMotion here be able to show us exactly what's going on. Again, the blue one, which is the radial and the ulnar, isn't a big surprise. This player doesn't have a ton of radial and ulnar in their swing, and generally, like I said before, part of that reason is when you push a wrist into flexion, it's actually very difficult to add radial. Okay, you can try that yourselves. Hopefully we got 90 Australian PGA guys doing this right now. But you can't really cock it up and down very well. Now, if I push the wrist into extension, man, I can cock that much more fully into radial deviation. So we can see that the speed here is going in a completely different direction. The release mechanism is completely different. This player is going to have more of, let's call it a little bit more of a Spider-Man release, where we move that wrist into extension this way. They're not going to have a big sort of supinated release here. So this is our new school release, as we call it. And as I said, we've got players like DJ and Victor Hovland, Colin Morikawa, Brooks Koepka. And, you know, the flexion keeps out the excessive radial. The club face vector, this is the interesting thing, is when your wrist is hard in flexion, that vector around sort of P6 or last parallel here is really pointed toward the ground, okay? From there, the player is actually pivoting, jumping, extending, doing these things, and they're actually dragging this vector up in the air. So the vector goes from low right, or the club face pointed, if you put a flashlight on the face, is pointed low and to the right, and then it's going to get pulled up and to the left, okay? So we see this becomes more of a pivot-driven sort of release as opposed to, let's say, hands and forearm dominated release. The release, as I said, is sort of a scoop release. I would say, you know, to a certain extent, less stable in the loft perspective because I have to make sure I'm driving my pivot really, really hard. And we see that every once in a while with a player like DJ or Koepka. Often their miss becomes a pull, okay? And what that is basically they decelerated just a little bit, and this wrist, which needs to be sort of held in a certain position, ends up releasing a little bit toward flexion, and the face closes a wee bit and sends that ball sort of long and left. So generally you'll see with this type of a player, you'll see lower right misses, or let's say middle right misses, and you'll actually see higher left misses than option A. So option A, like Tommy, he's gonna hit high push draw, low overdraw, or mid-flight overdraw. This player is actually gonna hit sort of mid-right, high and straight, or actually fairly high and left. So the pull actually gets up in the air, which makes it a very interesting one. So we see a lot of players who employ this type of release pattern are fade biased players. Now, what I've seen from my observation with a bunch of my tour players with this is that I think the long clubs will be a little bit more consistent because we're kind of lining that club face up to the target and that vector a little bit earlier, if you will. With our long clubs, I would say sometimes with the wedges, it leads to some inconsistency in trajectory just because, you know, this is obviously controlling the loft a lot more. So often inside of 50 yards, my personal preference is actually for a player to do wrist option A on short game shots to a certain extent, and wrist option B on full shots. Just my sort of personal preference there. All right, so again, the third option here that I've seen, again, these are all patterns I've tested out. I think I've got a good 50 or 60 tour pros now in the database. And again, they fall very closely inside these sort of parameters. Option C, this is a little bit of your old school as well. This is a player that adds a fair amount of down cock in the down swing, okay? This player is a very long player, one of my players who plays in Japan. About 185 ball speed on the driver. So this was last year at the Canadian Open, which was at our club that Rory won. And I tested Richard on his wrist angles, and this is kind of what we saw. And a little bit of a different sort of pattern, and it has changed a little bit since this time, but basically what we get is sort of a double bump in the radial ulnar, okay? So this player is taking this up. At the top of the swing, there's a certain amount of radial, but on the way down, he's definitely increasing this radial on the way down. That's where we see this arrow sort of bump up and kind of go into a little bit more radial deviation. The interesting thing too, sort of just as a quick aside with all this, is the blue one to a certain extent, the length of that line as well as the steepness of that line is actually club head speed. Okay, so we can kind of look at that from a graphical standpoint and tell if a player has really got a lot of high speed and how they're creating it. So in this particular case, there's a lot of club head speed for him that's coming from that radial to ulnar, okay? What we want to make sure, and this is where it gets interesting, is I don't like how the green one moves quite a bit. He actually takes it back. He's got a fairly strong grip here. Halfway back, he flattens that wrist actually a little bit into flexion. As he gets to the top, it starts to sneak back toward extension, okay? And that's the danger, is when he would down cock, every once in a while he would kind of pull this into extension, face would open a little bit and he'd kind of block it to the right. So what we've worked on is trying to stabilize that green one a little bit better, not have it sort of waver as much going back, have it a little bit quieter. But the most important part is we can see where that green line actually moves to back the other way. And that wrist moves toward flexion before he peaks his radial, okay? Now that's pretty in depth there, but basically what that means is that's safe because he's increasing. That's a very tough move. You gotta have really strong hands. Robert Garrigus would be another player that does this. You need really, really strong hands and wrists to be able to do this, but you're actually pushing this wrist again toward flexion, but actually increasing the radial at the same time, okay? Now from there, he goes ahead and drives his pivot very hard and lets this thing out, hits it. Now the interesting thing around impact is kind of the club head speed goes everywhere. So in this particular player, you know, that club head speed's going boom into ulnar. It's trying to kick back on the green one, back into extension very rapidly after impact. And there's also a little bit of rotation there. So this is a player that's handling this club face in all three directions, okay? Probably wouldn't be my favorite, but Richard's a heck of a ball striker. He likes to hit a whole bunch of different shots. He's an incredibly long hitter. So at this point, we're sort of just massaging this sort of pattern as opposed to changing it. But you will see this in some of your players who they will add this kind of radial on the way down, but you'll often see that green one move more and bump up with the blue one and move into more extension on the way down. That becomes very dangerous. I would definitely avoid that. All right, any questions so far?
There's been a couple come through, so we might have a bit of a pause for a second, maybe answer the first one, because this might be an interesting one. Someone's
Sure.
asked, if you see a player with tendencies of the two of the patterns, how do you choose which pattern you go with that player?
Great question, and to be honest with you, I would, it depends a little bit on their ability. You know, if they're already a very good player, you know, if they're a tour player or a very good junior golfer who is, you know, handles the golf ball quite well, I would just have them understand their pattern and maybe massage it or calm it down if it has a little bit too much variance in it. But I probably wouldn't flat out change the pattern. Now, if you're dealing with, you know, your higher handicap players, I mean, these are good looking graphs, okay? I mean, when you put this on your amateur golfers, be prepared. It's like a roller coaster ride. There's so much going on. So generally, just as a quick aside, the reason tour players' wrists look so much better graphically than an amateur is the fact that if my body can turn and pivot very easily, okay, there's less change at the wrist level. Now, if my body doesn't turn particularly well, and I'm taking this thing back with my arms and my hands, my elbows are separating, you're going to see all sorts of change at the wrist level. So obviously we have to sort of customize that toward the players that we're working with, but in general, those beginning and sort of mid-level players need to really understand how to move well, so the effect is that it actually quiets out the wrists and then gives them a repeatable ball flight. Do you want to do the second question now, or do you want to?
Yeah, we'll just do Tom's now, then we might go on a bit more presentation. So Tom, you came through when you were talking about your preference between pattern A and pattern B for long irons and short irons. So do you actually coach players that have the talent to do that, to have pattern A in their short irons and pattern B in their longer clubs?
At the high levels, yes. I would say I would have a little bit different release styles. I mean, to be honest with you, there's even more than that. You know, I like my players to have at least two grips, you know, a short game grip and a long game grip, and then learn how to use those. So wrist option A, when you actually have a little bit more rotation and this wrist is sort of stays a little quieter and we don't push it so hard into flexion, what that does, that exposes the bounce. So it's very useful around the greens and shots under 40, 50 yards where we're trying to hit that very softly, very high with a little bit of spin if I have a little bit more of this release. If I'm going a little bit more flexion, a little bit more of a driving flight on those short game shots, might be able to hit like low spinners and things like that with that type of a wrist release pattern. But it's going to be hard to hit like your basic stock mid to high level pitch with a fair amount of bounce. So I would teach my really good juniors or my pros to do that. Your average, obviously, golfer, we're going to try and stick with probably one grip and one pattern.
That makes common sense. So if you want to keep going, we'll get to some other questions as we go along.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so a couple pieces with this option C, increasing radial downcock model. I see this a lot in really long hitters. To Richard, my guy, as well as Robert Garrigus sort of expose this. The key is increasing that radial while moving toward flexion is a very difficult movement. So to explain that again, let me just grab my club here. Let's turn the camera here. So a player that's sort of here at the top here, okay, for this wrist to move toward flexion at the same time as it moves toward more radial is actually a very difficult maneuver there. Okay, most players are going to go the opposite way and pull their wrist into extension as they increase this radial. Okay, so that's a bit of a tough move for a lot of players to get. So often I'll underload the wrist. Okay, so a lot of players, in fact, my good players are long enough. They're looking for higher levels of control. I try and take out some of that excess radial a lot of the time. But if a player like Richard can handle that, he's a very accurate ball striker as well as very long. So I again at this point just managing that. The interesting thing about the club face vector, it has more of a medium loft and a medium right bias entering the impact interval and more loft exiting than option A. So it's kind of in the middle. So if you imagine kind of going across your screen here, that the wrist option A is making the face point high and to the right. That's why you're going to hit a block. A little bit to the right, you're going to hit a nice push draw, or low and to the left, you get a low hook. Okay. On the flip side, if you've got the other option, sort of flexion to extension, you sort of have a little bit lower right, mid-level sort of on target, and a little bit of a medium high pull. Okay, so that vector is moving completely opposite directions between wrist option A and wrist option B. This one here is kind of a little bit more just horizontal. Okay, kind of moves across the sky a little bit, but it doesn't really change loft a whole lot in my testing with this. So kind of an interesting difference. Okay, I guess it all depends on what you want your miss to look like. If you're tired of hitting that hook, you may want to employ option B and learn how to do this sort of flexion toward extension stuff. If you've got a player that's doesn't really understand how to use their hands, never hit like sort of a turn down draw type of a thing, you may want to teach them option A. I do find though a lot of the players that do have some downcock will downcock it to create different trajectories. So if I want to hit it lower, they'll really downcock this thing, increase that angle of attack, de-loft the heck out of this thing and hit it sort of a stinger. They'll sort of downcock a little less, maybe release this a little bit more at impact to be able to hit the ball a little bit higher. So I do find that players that like to shape shots and hit different trajectories and windows, a lot of them kind of fall into this wrist option C pattern. Okay. The last one I got is my guy on the PGA Tour, MACKENZIE Hughes. And I worked with MACKENZIE since he was 15. And, he has sort of an interesting model because we're going to call it option D because it's kind of in between those two models, okay, or three models really. So what we see is the green one, which is the flexion to extension. As he brings this thing back, he has a very strong sort of four knuckle grip here. He loses a little bit of that extension. He moves it toward flexion, still a little bit on the extended side. Okay, but the interesting thing is how he releases it because he's actually releasing this a little bit this way, okay, a little bit this way as he adds the ulnar. Okay, and that's what that picture kind of shows. So he kind of falls into this category of not really wrist option A, not really wrist option B, but something in between. And in his particular case, it's definitely because of the initial grip. Has a very strong left-hand grip that we've, even from a very early age, he's had that grip. We just, was the non-negotiable thing he was going to change. He just never was going to change that. He likes to hit fades. primarily. So with that strong grip, he has to rotate his body really well, but he does actually release this a little bit toward extension at the same time. So he kind of turns his body very hard, but he also releases a little bit this way, okay, and kind of creates this little bit of a 3 to 5 left swing direction and creates a path with his irons. It's about 1.5 to 2 to the left, and the face is usually about 1/2 to the left. So it's a beautiful little pull cut a lot of the time. So when we sort of increase this flexion, then releasing prior to impact with some rotation, this is a player who likes to hit a similar trajectory and shape the majority of the time, okay? So he does not really ever want to see the ball go right to left. He likes to see a very, very straight ball flight to very slight fade all the time, all the way through the bag. If he wants to hit a draw, he just takes a 3-wood, pushes the handle forward, moves the ball back, and hits down on it a bit, and kind of squeezes a little draw with a 3-wood. But otherwise, for the most part, wants to hit sort of one shape all the time. So that's the other thing too, is have your players, when you get your HackMotion there, hit different shots, because you will see subtle variations, okay? Not massively, you won't see, you know, the complete reversal or anything like that generally, but you will see slight changes in the amounts depending on whether that player is trying to hit a draw or a fade. In MACKENZIE's case, if we go back to his graph, we're just trying to keep this very, very, very stable. You can see that that green line, although it does diminish a little bit toward impact, that is world-class stability right there. There's not a lot of change in that plane. As I said, it starts a little bit here, goes a little bit there. Okay, at impact, he actually gains a little bit of flexion. And again, this is the one player who actually hits the golf ball kind of like Lee Westwood with that lead wrist a little bit extended. It's not actually flat or in flexion at all. All right. So questions. So what have we got?
There's been heaps come through, Scott, so certainly appreciate you going through that. So a question from Graham. So do you always talk about wrist positions and angles to improve a player's ball flight? So his comment was, with experienced players, I'm thinking you could ask them to hit certain shots to improve the motion.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, one of the things I'll do with them is actually sort of run a combine. So just like, you know, you put your TrackMan out and run a little bit of a combine. With my really good players, I will run them through a combine where I'll have them hit different shots. And I'm actually sort of taking a look at obviously what their TrackMan data is saying, but also how are they actually doing that? How are they producing that at the wrist level? Because all of those shots, I mean, ultimately that's sort of the last piece of the puzzle there. If we understand what they're doing at the wrist level, we can understand their miss patterns a lot better and maybe be able to sort of tighten those things a little bit more. Most definitely when you see world-class players, it's almost literally the identical signature every time. The amounts are similar, the overall signature and how it moves is very similar. And that's why, to be honest with you, I stick with the graphs most of the time. There is some excellent other pieces in the software where you've got some tiles, you've got a 3D rendering of actually what's going on at the wrist that you can slow down and take a look at. Just the way that my brain works, I like to see the whole big picture in all three planes at the same time.
Just quickly on those graphs, a couple of questions have come through. How long did it take you to get an understanding of what you were seeing in those graphs?
To be honest with you, it really wasn't that much time. You know, the best thing to do is just strap it on a player and have them hit a few shots, and then, you know, take stock of you know, where'd the ball go, you know, and from there sort of be able to sort of see a picture to a certain extent. I mean, those graphs are really giving you a very clear picture of, is a player rotating this through? Are they extending it through like this? And then how much is that changing shot to shot, and how much are those values changing shot to shot? Now I do want to just point out one quick little piece on this is, if you notice some of the graphs here, you'll see that the purple one always starts on 0, okay? So it knows where address is when you first take it back, and it's saying, okay, that's kind of where the target was, okay? Now, in MACKENZIE's case, like this last one, this came back pretty close to square, you know, right there. That purple line is going through almost right at impact. It's still a little tiny bit open at the point of impact. When we looked at some of the other graphs there, we saw, you know, it moving through impact, but that flexion extension one you can see was actually held wide open a little bit. So it kind of gives me a picture of where the person's anatomy is around the golf ball. And then, but what I want you to understand is that how I actually calibrate this will dictate where those values start. So it's very important, if you're really looking at great data, you almost want to have your player sort of lay their hand on a table when you do the calibration, just so you get a very consistent value or starting position. If I hold this out in front of me and my wrist started here, okay, when I address the golf ball, it's going to say that this is really, really extended. If I started with my wrist a little bit this way and then did it, it's going to say that my wrist wasn't extended as much, because it's really just taking the two sensors and sort of drawing a line, if you will, between those, which is fine by me because I understand that those values may change, but what doesn't change is the signature and sort of the absolute values and the differences. Okay, so I hope everybody understands that. But in terms of reading the graphs, it doesn't take much time at all. I said there's a wonderful database to go through and just look at and see what a lot of the good players are doing. And then, you know, as we sort of continue to fill out the database, sort of at headquarters, if you will, they've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples now that are falling sort of into one of these four categories.
Makes sense. So, question from Andrew: does the body have more influence on the club or the wrist conditions?
Well, I would say this: the body is influencing the wrist conditions, which are then influencing the club position. So, for example, if I'm coming down in that extension, you know, I'm obviously going to have a very different face angle when this wrist is extended than when it's in flexion. So that's going to alter how a player sort of squares this thing up and what the timing of what they're doing to square this thing up. If I'm coming down, this face is laying wide open, it's going to take me a lot of work here at impact to square it up. I still might be able, you know, I'm still going to hit perhaps some good shots, but I want to understand how is the player doing it. If a player is coming more into flexion, there's less work to do at the wrist level and they're driving their pivot faster. Again, at the tour level, a good player level, you're going to see how they compensate for those wrist angles. Your poor golfer is got those terrible wrist angles and doesn't know what to do with them. Okay, so that's the choice we have to make as instructors: is do we change those wrist alignments so that then the body can move a little bit differently? For your middle and high handicaps, I would say yes. Start at the wrist, then, you know, have the body understand what it needs to do to support those wrists. A lot of those players aren't going to be able to handle massive amounts of change around the golf ball.
That makes lots of sense to me. So, a question from Richard: which pattern would you teach to an amateur player who wants consistency? Is there a preference there for you?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I really like, you know, if we start at the top and we go to wrist option A, wrist option B, I really like wrist option A. I'm a bit old school in that respect, that I think we need to, you know, teach our hands how to sort of operate a little bit around the golf ball. I can't remember, one of you Aussies said that you know, your hands were like two Aussie sheepdogs. If you didn't train them properly, they'd kill all your sheep. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. You know, if we understand how these wrists sort of move from a loft perspective as well as squaring up perspective, working on shorter shots, your beginning golfer who's always in extension, always slicing across it, really needs to educate the hands a little bit first. So often, if they're in that category, I will sort of move toward wrist option A. If they're a good player already, maybe a good junior who's hitting blocks and hooks all the time, often I might move them, you know, if they're totally fed up with them, I might move them toward flexion extension. It's a lot easier to hit a fade. It's a lot easier to get rid of sort of a low left, high right combo by pushing the wrists in this direction. Most of the players that you'll see, as I said, with this pattern are straight to fade type ball planes. But sorry, little caveat with that though is that you better be able to turn and pivot very, very fast. So if you can't do that, I wouldn't take a person who can't move their body particularly well and teach them loads of flexion, because they're never going to be able to handle it in terms of how fast they have to drive their pivot. They're going to lose this all day long and probably hit it dead left. So that would be.
So that kind of ties into the next question from Axel. Axel, someone's club head speed of the 7.9 is about 80 miles per hour with average pivot movement. So you don't suggest they go with type B, you suggest maybe type A or type C?
Yeah, I mean, again, I would look at it more from a directional standpoint. I mean, that's an okay amount of club head speed. I mean, what I do find with flexion to extension is, if you're really trying to ramp it up, I think it is a better method in terms of creating club head speed, because there's less that you're doing around the golf ball with the face, so you can drive the pivot harder. Now, I need to be able to do that. So if a player can't drive their pivot really, really fast, and they're relying on perhaps their hands and arms to create speed a little bit more as opposed to their body, that would be kind of my deciding factor. But you know, if they're game and they want to play around a little bit, I'm not adverse to messing around a little bit and seeing how it feels too.
Sorry, got distracted. There was a big question came through. So excuse me. Just a question from Christian. What variants do you teach in body motion to match the differing wrist settings and releasing?
Well, you know, basically what we're dealing with to a certain extent is, if you're employing wrist option A, for the most part, unless you're Tommy Fleetwood, that player is turning this thing down a little bit and they're going to lose a little bit of trail elbow bend as they hit it. Okay, so their arms are going to be a little bit straighter when they hit the golf ball, because they're using that mechanism, the trail arm going from external rotation toward neutral, to help create some supination and square the face up. The player in wrist option B has got this inflection. They're actually going to hold this wrist to elbow bend, first accumulator stuff, and drive that pivot very, very hard all the way through, and not really change this as much. Okay, so again, only so many people can do that second one. You need an awful lot of flexibility in your rotation and side bend to be able to hit a golf ball with a fair amount of bend in that trail arm. So that would probably be my preference, if you're dealing with a good player who's trying to perhaps stabilize the face a little bit. But you know, there's lots of great players that are hitting the ball quite hard with that right hand and that trail arm extension.
Okay, so question from Steve. From your experience and in your opinion, how important is the lack of trail wrist information? Which obviously with HackMotion don't have trail wrist information. How does it impact how you look at club face control, etc.?
Well, that's the interesting thing. They are currently in development of the trail wrist as well. So we will have that capability at some point. That was a big ask at the PGA show. I did this same presentation at the PGA show in Orlando, and that was one of the questions that came up, is when can we get sort of trail wrist data? And basically everybody there put their hand up and said, we want trail wrist data. So they are working on it. The key is, do you want to do it independently of the other wrist, or are we going to try and combine the two of them into one? You know, how do we do that? You know, the problem with a little bit with the trail wrist is there's a lot more dorsiflexion there. So when you start looking at where those sensors are placed, it's a little bit trickier to sort of get the size of the sensors that they're using right now, pull them out. You know, they're not massive or anything, but with a lot of dorsiflexion, you might feel those sensors kind of get close together. So I'll just hold that up. So this is the unit. This is the unit here. Okay, so really you've got two sensors, the bottom sensor and the top sensor, and one's going on the back of the hand, one's going on the wrist, and that's how it's creating those measurements. So I would say it's coming. Right now, I would say I like lead wrist. I mean, I think trail wrist is certainly important, but I think that lead wrist has the, you know, basically a direct orientation to your club face and the loft and things like that. Trail wrist also has obviously some of that as well. You might get things like how quickly that wrist is extending at impact, how fast is it going from dorsiflexion into a neutral position, which I think would be quite interesting. But you know, even from here, I'm quite content with understanding that lead wrist. I was saying to Brent earlier that you know, I've got a lot of my players who play practice rounds actually with the sensor on and hit, a round of golf or 9 holes or whatever, and we'll go back and we'll look at every shot. Where did that miss go? Where did this one go? What did you do on that pitch? What did you do when you putted? And it's really quite interesting to see some things that maybe you're not going to see on the range or in the lab sort of setting, and you're seeing it more in the real environment. Especially if you've got that wayward shot every once in a while, it's kind of like, okay, there it is. What did we actually do at the wrist level that was different to create that shot? And that's where you're going to see it. You will see a change at the wrist level if that ball is massively offline. And again, that's the value to that.
Okay, so this is the one that threw me off guard, a 3-parter from questions come through. So the first part is, we'll probably deal with them one by one. So what is the most common pattern you see in club level golfers and slicers, for example? Is there a certain pattern that you see all the time?
You don't see any of those. You don't see any of those 4, unfortunately. So you're always moving toward those. No, I say that in a little bit in jest, but basically what you see with the average golfer, because they can't rotate particularly well, what happens as they get about halfway back here, to get this over their shoulder, they have to separate their elbows. As they separate their elbows, they're pushing this lead wrist into extension. So often you're going to see a massive amount of extension at the top of the swing. Okay, as they come down, they don't know what to do with it. So generally they're going to pull on the handle here and they're going to throw it to try and sort of square this up and obviously use their body and come over the top a little bit. So generally you're going to see a lot of flexion. You'll see that green one spike. I mean, honestly, you'll see it 60, 70 degrees of extension. It's amazing how much that really will change. And then, they're trying to get it back to the golf ball, but they really have no chance from there. So teaching those players to swing it shorter with a little bit less change in the flexion extension, kind of toward wrist option A, is probably where I would start. Not many of those players we're going to push them into flexion because they just can't move their bodies and side bend very well. And that's the stipulation. You can't do this pattern if you can't turn and side bend.
Makes sense. So part 2 was, how hard have you found it is for them to actually change those patterns?
Very quick. Yeah, 1 lesson typically, at least to get going. In terms of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Often in a few swings, that's the beautiful thing, is once they have the instruction, they kind of understand what it feels like. They'll make changes in 2-3 swings. To get it where you want it and to get it sort of consistent, it may take a little bit longer, but honestly, it can change almost immediately. And not only that, but you've got that data. Obviously, you've got your eye, you can see the ball flight, but because you've got that and you can see, hey, that was 50% better than that swing before, and that was 75% better. You can see their progression. One of the cool features on the HackMotion is you can actually set benchmarks so that if they exceed a certain range in a certain plane of motion, they get sort of a buzzer, or they get an auditory sort of feedback like K-Best, where they've gone outside of their range. So now they preset, say, okay, let's bring it up again. Let's try and keep this flat. So if it gets hard into extension, the buzzer goes off. And because of that feedback, they can really improve very quickly.
That's cool. And his third part of his question, which I think is tied into a bit to what Travis has asked as well. So have you found any injuries in the players trying to make the changes or because of bad wrist angles? And Travis also asked, do you see any relation with injuries like tennis elbow to certain wrist movements?
That's a great question. You know what? I would say that, a lot of our lady golfers, sort of middle handicap, higher handicap lady golfers, who tend to get the tennis elbow and so on, generally they lack the strength to be able to support this sort of pulling weight of the club in any kind of a flexion state. So if they hit the ground like this, it's probably not a good idea for them. They just can't handle the stress of that strike to the turf. Having something a little bit more sort of in a neutral plane of motion as opposed to a hard flexion is probably a better idea for them. They may need to learn how to supinate. One of the things that you'll see at a club golfer level, you'll see that green one moves back all the way into extension very early, and they're using this mechanism to square the face, okay? So the difference between that motion and sort of the cobra pattern, the flexion extension pattern, is the good players continuing to drive their pivot as this slowly comes out. The bad player stops their pivot dead and then flicks this out very suddenly. Obviously, having low point problems, contact problems, etc. So I would probably teach them to wrist option A a little bit, as I said, kind of educate those hands first, And then if they got really good and they can move their bodies quick enough, so a lot of your good juniors that are, 12, 13, 14 years old that are starting to get stronger and faster, those are the players that would probably push more toward flexion extension.
Okay, so a comment here from Axel. So do you agree that if the lower body is square at impact, it's almost impossible to have flexion on the left wrist?
Yes.
And then if then, how would you still help players to hit it solid, not by scooping it?
Well, a lot of that's concept for them, right? Is generally usually at that point they've got a very weak grip to start with. So generally when they're doing that, they're using that mechanism, shutting their pivot off and staying square to the golf ball and flicking their wrist at it to try and square the face up. So I would check grip first. If it's not grip, then I would check on how are they actually using this, and they may need to learn how to actually take a club and hold it out in front of them and actually be able to supinate this a little bit and feel that torque across the top of the forearm into the ball. So whether that's just short little shots where they're doing that type of a release pattern. Overall, I don't like square hips at the ball, but we see it every day depending on the player that's in front of us. So if we can get them to be able to rotate and side bend even a little bit, then I think you're going to see that wrist get pulled more toward flexion.
Makes a lot of sense. Last couple of questions, then we'll let you go. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. Question from David. Have you found that incorrect lie angles can affect the wrist angles?
Oh, great question. Absolutely. For your club fits, etc. This is where it gets really interesting. Clubs that are too short, too long, lie angles that are off. Big time, you'll see sometimes some big changes. If you've got a player that's using 3-4 degrees upright, too long, and they've gotten a hand-me-down set or whatever, and they actually swing on a reasonable plane, obviously that heel's going to catch on the ground all day long unless they sort of raise this handle up. And that's where you'll see the blue one actually go beyond what it starts. So if you look at all these graphs, you can kind of see how the starting ulnar radial amount and the impact ulnar radial amount are very, very, very tightly close together. They're not really that changed. They're almost identical values. A player that's using poor fit clubs, you'll often see them adapt to that, okay? And if they're using too upright a club, they'll throw this past that original amount into the ulnar side. So again, it gives you a good view of a lot of things if you kind of know how to read it.
Cool. And just a question on using the sensor for putting. Have you used it for putting, and how useful have you found it?
You know what? It's really amazing. I do use it quite a bit for putting. It's interesting. Whereas the full swing, we find there's more problems in the sort of flexion to extension plane in the wrist. In putting, it's actually really interesting. There's more problems in the radial and ulnar, which is what I've seen with most players. They either, a lot of times when that putter's sitting on the ground, as soon as they pick that putter up, what happens is it droops. It goes a little bit toward ulnar. Okay, and then as they do that and it tips toward ulnar, depending on their hand position, that actually rotates the face. So they can actually close the face a little bit. So if I got a fairly strong putting grip with the right hand and I go ulnar as I start, the face will actually close as I take it back. Then obviously I'm going to do some other things coming through. So, it's very interesting to see how that affects it. But usually it's the blue plane with the putting that's more susceptible. Longer putts, we might see more of that flexion extension as a power source. Okay, we can really talk to the player about how they're actually powering the putt. Rotational amounts are very, very soft. The cool thing is on the graphs that the window on the graph changes. So it's sort of like a maximum of like 10 or 20 degrees on either side, whereas the full swing graph is 120 160 on both sides of the graph. So there's a lot tighter range when you're looking at the putting, and they're able to sort of fine tune that. So basically, to a certain extent, you shouldn't see a lot of change except a little bit in the rotation value because of the pivot, a little bit with the putter. But there's not a lot of changes this way and not a lot of changes this way in good putters.
Makes sense. Now, one final question from Andrew. So what creates the most club head speed, flexion into extension or vice versa?
Well, I would say players that are I'm going to be in general here. There is a direct correlation in general between the strength of your grip, and the wrist conditions that you employ, and how fast you can pivot. Okay, so generally your longest hitters have the strongest grips, and they're the most open at impact. Okay. From 1990 to now, so 30 years, the average tour player is somewhere between 15 to 17 degrees more open on the pelvis and thorax than they were 30 years ago. So there is a correlation between the rotational speeds as well as sort of the grip and sort of attachment conditions, and trying to match those things up. So if I'm going to rotate really hard, basically you need a strong grip or a strong wrist condition. If I don't rotate well and I'm sort of square at the ball, maybe a little bit weaker wrist condition is what's right for you.
Well, you seem to have answered all the questions today, Scott. Thank you so much for coming